So with the rise of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s in Germany, more than ever, Germany appeared to be a military threat to France. And France redoubled its efforts to try and find dependable allies who could help in any potential war with Germany. And one of the states they looked to was Italy, under Benito Mussolini. Obviously, we know that during the Second World War, the Italians under Mussolini fought with Nazi Germany. So it might initially seem odd that the French thought they could make an alliance with Mussolini, but in reality, both Mussolini and Hitler were hyper-nationalist dictators, and to most international observers in the 1930s, it made more sense that Mussolini and Hitler would go to war with one another as opposed to becoming allies. In particular, there were German speakers in parts of northern Italy that Mussolini was concerned about that Hitler might try and annex part of Italy in order to create this greater German state of all German speakers. So in 1935, the French actually made a formal alliance with Italy, the Franco-Italian alliance. So obviously you'll recognize Mussolini here on the right. On the left is Pierre Laval, who was the French foreign minister at the time, and we'll come across Laval a few times over the next couple of lectures as well. The alliance was basically one of kind of friendship. The Azua Strip, which was in a small area of land. So Libya was an Italian colony. Chad was a French colony, so the French basically gave a little territory to Italy as well as part of this deal. There wasn't really any hard commitment to help one another in the case of the war, but the French took this as a kind of positive that at least they were bringing Mussolini over to their side and hoping that this might be the beginning of a more formal military alliance between them. But the danger of Germany, or the obvious threat the Germans were presenting, became evident just a couple of weeks later when Hitler announced his intention to fully rearm the German army. Now, in some ways, this was only a confirmation of what the Germans had actually been doing since the 1920s, even prior to the rise of Adolf Hitler. But naturally, this was a very, very clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. It alarmed the French, it alarmed the Italians, and it alarmed the British as well. But put long story short, the French had potentially considered the option of attacking Germany in response, but without the willingness of the British in particular to agree to a military attack on Germany, the French felt they had no option but to stand back. But the British, French and Italians did come together at a place called Stresa in Italy. There was a conference held in April 1935. And the three people pictured here on the left with the glasses looking at the cards is Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister. And we have Mussolini in the centre. And the guy with the little moustache on the right looking at Hitler is Pierre-Etienne Flandin, who was the French Prime Minister. They came together and basically agreed that they wouldn't accept any more violations of the Treaty of Versailles, and but potentially opening the door to military reprisals against Hitler if the Germans took any more steps to violate the Treaty of Versailles. So we have the emergence of something of a political alliance between the Italians, the British, and the French in April 1935. Meanwhile, the French continued to look anywhere and elsewhere for allies. Starting in the early 1930s, the French foreign minister was a guy called Louis Barthou, and he had pushed the idea of an alliance with the Soviet Union, arguing that the French had a lot to gain, that the Soviet Union was potentially a much more important ally for France in the case of a war with Germany. And Barthou had almost established or almost nailed down an agreement with the Soviet Union in 1934 when Barthou himself was assassinated alongside the King of Yugoslavia, King Alexander I. Both men were assassinated by a Bulgarian nationalist in France in October 1934. Barthou was replaced by Pierre Laval. Laval was, even though he began his career as a socialist, he was becoming increasingly anti-communist in his position and felt that really France should have nothing to do with the Soviet Union. But in response to German rearmaments in 1935, Laval was encouraged by his government to kind of take up Barthou's project of a treaty with the Soviet Union once more. And in the summer of 1935, the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance was concluded. On the surface, it appeared like actually a pretty strong union. It said that if France or the Soviet Union was attacked by another power, they would come to one another's assistance. But in reality, Laval had worded the term of it such that France would only agree to help the Soviet Union if the other powers who signed the Locarno Pact, which was Belgium, Italy, and United Kingdom, agreed. So on the surface, it looked like a reasonably strong alliance, but in practice, it didn't actually. It was unlikely that the terms of the treaty would ever lead to an actual assistance between the French and the Russians. And then, only a few weeks later, the French were absolutely blindsided. They received a knife in the back, as it were, from the news that the British had concluded an agreement with the Germans, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935. Basically, the Germans agreed to make their navy no larger than 35% of the size of the British Navy. This was a very, very clear violation, first of the Treaty of Versailles. It was a very clear violation of the Stresa-Front conference that was held literally only weeks earlier. And both the French and Italians were absolutely furious that the British had made this deal with the Germans and in contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. And in particular, that was the beginning and the end of the Stresa-Front, especially Italy's involvement in the Stresa-Front. One of the other challenges for the British and French in trying to form an alliance against the Germans was keeping Italy closely in alliance with them, because the Italians were very eager for military expansion, military conquest in Africa. I have a Jeopardy question for you all to explain this a little more. So the Battle of Adwa, sometimes known as the Battle of Adwa, fought in 1896, saw the Italians defeated by this kingdom. What is Abyssinia, or what is Ethiopia? So the Italians in the late 19th century had tried to conquer Abyssinia, had been defeated, had been humiliated basically, and Ethiopia remained the only European country, or the only African country, that was not colonized during the scramble for Africa. And Mussolini was very determined to avenge what was frankly an astonishing humiliation of an Italian army at the hands of an African army in 1896. And so he was planning for an invasion of Ethiopia. You see here, so the Eritrea was an Italian colony, Italian Somaliland was obviously an Italian colony, and Abyssinia was an independent kingdom in between both of them. And the Italians basically wanted to attack and conquer Abyssinia. This had been kind of on the books for a couple of years. The British and French had not brought it up at the Stresa-Front in April 1935, and Mussolini had taken this as a kind of signal that or kind of tacit approval, if you will, of the desire of or at least tacit approval by the French and Germans to allow Italy to invade Ethiopia. And so that's exactly what the Italians do in 1935, and this causes public outrage across most of Europe, certainly in the democratic countries of Europe, in Britain and France in particular, that essentially the Italians were invading a sovereign independent kingdom for the prospect of conquest. However, the governments of Britain and France, in particular members of the governments of Britain and France in particular, were much more pragmatic in their view of what should be done. So in 1935, Pierre Laval, who by this stage was the Prime Minister of France, no longer just the Foreign Minister, Prime Minister of France, and Samuel Hoare, who was the British Foreign Minister, concluded something that's called the LaValle Pact. Basically, they agreed to make Italy an offer that they would allow, and you see the map here, they would allow Italy to keep certain parts of Ethiopia, the stripy green and white part. They would be annexed to the Italian colonies there. There would also be an extended Italian influence into other parts of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, and then parts of Ethiopia would remain fully independent. And from the point of view of the French and British, they felt this was, or at least of Laval and Hoare, they felt this was a fair arrangement, that Mussolini would get his military conquest, Ethiopia would remain independent, at least part of it, and that to an extent everyone would be a winner. But once word of this deal was leaked in December 1935, it provoked outrage across the masses of the United Kingdom and France. Léon Blum in the French Parliament heavily criticised Laval, and to quote him here, "You have tried to give and keep. You wanted to have your cake and eat it. You cancelled your words by your deeds and your deeds by your words. You have debased everything by fixing, intrigue and slickness. Not sensitive enough to the importance of great moral issues, you have reduced everything to the level of your petty methods." And essentially this forced the resignation of Laval in January 1936, and the deal never went through, and Mussolini went on and conquered Ethiopia anyway. But this was very much a beginning point of Mussolini's turn away from the British and French and towards Nazi Germany. In the spring of 1936, Mussolini had made it known to the German ambassador in Italy that if Germany wanted to annex or at least bring Austria under its control, Mussolini would not object. And basically Mussolini felt that the criticisms of the British and French to his invasions of Ethiopia meant that they were not really dependable as allies, and nor would they actually stand up to the Germans anyway. And from Mussolini's point of view, it made more sense to try and work with Hitler as opposed to working against Hitler. So that was the end of any possible alliance between the French and Italians in terms of trying to stop Nazi Germany. The next big crisis in 1936 was to do with the Rhineland. We've obviously seen the Rhineland before. The French soldiers withdrew from the Rhineland in 1930. But by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, no German soldiers were allowed to go in there. It was supposed to act as a buffer zone to defend Germany or defend France against any French invasion. Hitler had always planned to actually invade and retake the Rhineland. But he was planning to wait until the German army was strong enough to fend off any German invasion. But in the spring of 1936, Hitler thought he saw an opportunity to gamble to try and retake the Rhineland immediately. His justification for doing so was the Franco-Soviet alliance of 1935. He claimed that was proof that the French and the Soviets were plotting against Germany, and it was only in Germany's natural interests to retake the Rhineland to defend itself. Furthermore, he felt that the political chaos in France with the resignation of LaValle in January 1936, the rise of the Popular Front, and the kind of disruption that was causing the French political scene meant that France would be too distracted to do anything. So, in March of 1936, Hitler ordered a small German force to enter into the Rhineland. Many of the German generals thought this was an enormous gamble. Many of them afterwards said if the French had simply sent in the army then, there was nothing we could have done. We would have been defeated. And Hitler himself only sent in a small army precisely with the idea that if the French did make a move, he could pull them back and claim that it was only a minor force. There was nothing really intended by it. But the French do not act. The French do not intervene. That, despite their deep discomfort with the fact the Germans have taken the Rhineland, they don't do anything. The attitude of the French is, well, we should run and do something, but no, we're going to go back and go elsewhere. So why didn't the French intervene? A couple of reasons. Again, the British made it pretty clear they did not feel that the German occupation of the Rhineland was grounds for an attack against Germany. David Lloyd George, the former British Prime Minister, in fact said Hitler would have been a traitor not to occupy the Rhineland, and many of them felt that as the Rhineland was German, this was simply natural. But the other issue was to do with this symbol on the screen here, which is the franc. The French economy was obviously in deep trouble in 1936. It was calculated that the only way they could actually deal with the Germans was mobilizing the entire French army. And it was calculated that would cost 30 million francs a day to do so, which the French government simply was a cost it was not willing to pay. And so the French, kind of against their kind of intuition, did not intervene when the Germans occupied the Rhineland. And in fact, the Germans began to build their own defensive line. So construction on this, the German equivalent of the Maginot Line, began in 1935. The answer is, what is the Siegfried Line? So we've shown here, this is the picture of the Siegfried Line in red. But this had consequences for France. I mean, essentially it had shown, firstly, the German occupation of the Rhineland had complicated the plans of the Maginot Line because now the German soldiers were right on the border with France. The Belgians kind of took the French refusal to do anything with the Rhineland as a sign that the French would never help them if the Germans attacked them, and therefore they ended their alliance with France to adopt a position of neutrality. And similarly, the powers of the Little Entente powers in Poland realized that the French offers of help were essentially useless because they wouldn't even take action against the Rhineland when their own interests were threatened. So how could they ever expect the French to help them if the Germans threatened their respective interests as well? Furthermore, the construction of the Siegfried Line meant that if Germany, say, attacked Poland or Czechoslovakia, it would be very difficult for them to provide any practical assistance in that case anyway. So the consequence of the Rhineland was that France's series of alliances with nations of Eastern Europe essentially collapsed because the French had shown that when push came to shove, they would be very unlikely to help those powers, and those powers now sought to create their own relationship with Germany outside of an alliance with France.